important is grammar during the initial stages of language learning?
So I would say that's why it's important to start learning a
Mhm.
few chunks, because without grammar, without some sort of order to what you're saying, it's going to be very hard for other speakers of the language to understand you. So that's why it's important in the initial stages of language learning that you're learning these chunks that you can string together. Then once you get a little bit more knowledge of the language, as I said, you start to analyze those chunks. So is grammar important? It is important for comprehension. Is it important for you to know every aspect of a language's grammar right from the beginning? No, it's not. So rules of thumb, like if you think about learning a language like Spanish, a lot of times when you learn it in school, they'll give you these rules of thumb, like the preterite is used for
Yeah.
completed action. And if you see it with this set of adverbs, you know to use the preterite. That ends up giving you results like this, where a person who is trying to speak the language then pauses in the middle of what they say to like count off the rules of thumb. I've seen students do this, like they're counting on their hand creations and stuff. So I would say not only is vocabulary learned better in context, but
Mhm.
grammar is also learned better in
Absolutely.
context. You need a lot of input in order to learn a language to any level. You need examples from the language. You need authentic examples. And so is grammar important at the beginning? Not as important, but you want to make sure, again, if you're trying to learn a language and you're trying to communicate with people, if what you're saying is gibberish, then it's going to be hard. So you want to make sure that you're, again, learning those chunks at first, stringing the chunks together, and then moving on to more analytical uses of grammar. And what I would say too is just not to put too fine a point on it, but think about how you learned your dominant language, whatever language you spoke at home as a child. You didn't really learn abstract
Absolutely.
grammar
Yeah.
rules.
Hmm.
You got a lot of examples and you imitated those examples. And when you made mistakes, people tried to correct you, but time that didn't work, right? Think about every time you've interacted with a child, if you try to correct a child's grammar, they
Exactly.
don't listen to you. What they're listening to are the
Hmm.
examples of what you say.
Yeah. So some common things in the classroom that I've noticed as being a Spanish teacher for many years is that some students get obsessed with, for example, learning courtesy phrases like in English, like I would like a pound of tomatoes or something like that. You're at the market and I like a pound of tomatoes. And then they start to analyze, like, I would like, what is that? What verb is that? Oh, would like. Okay, so this is the conditional, but is this really a condition? You're just asking nicely. So it's part of, uh, not simply just, you can't analyze it at, oh, it's a conditional phrase, but really in the context, it's not, if you think about it. So students get obsessed with analyzing, well, I have to learn all these conditional verbs in order to say this, but in reality, you don't. So what would you say to a student that gets obsessed with analyzing grammar in the initial stages before you start analyzing that a little bit more as you move along, as you transition to more effective speaking?
So if a student is hung up on
Mm-hmm.
a detail, I would just put it out there. If you get hung up on details, it's
Yeah.
going to slow you down, because any kind of human endeavor
Mm-hmm.
requires a lot of practice. Practice makes perfect. Perfection doesn't make perfect. Like you can't part. So practice makes perfect. Now, if you are teaching, if you're learning the language on your own using like apps and things like that, you have to have the discipline to recognize this in yourself and learn when to just let something go. But if you're learning it in a social context in a class, then, I think an effective instructor acknowledges this, because people know that if the grammar is wrong enough, it will mess up the message and
Mm-hmm.
I won't be communicating. I mean, that's something that we all kind of know intuitively. So a good teacher, though, I hesitate to use the word good, and it sounds judgmental, but like an effective teacher will, draw your attention
Mm-hmm.
away from that and remind you that the overall message is more important than perhaps some of the, pickier grammar details within it. Also, though, I think any effective program, whether it's self-taught or whether you're learning in a social context, provides you quality explanations. And I think a lot of times the explanations we get for some of the points of language are not
Mm-hmm.
so great. Like a lot of them rely on rules of thumb.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are using technical terms too that
Yeah.
people don't understand. So like as an English speaker learning Spanish, the grammar of English is very different than the grammar of Spanish. And so I've had all these teachers in my past that were like, it's the imperfect. Don't you know what the imperfect is? I'm like, no, English doesn't have that. English has past and non-past. We have run and ran. That's all we got. We don't have these categories that the languages descended from Latin have. So this idea that teachers would expect you to know these grammatical terms is frankly distracting, kind of annoying, like, and think too, like back to when we were learning about English as English dominant speakers, we learned like the noun, adjective kind of stuff. At least in my school system, we learned it in third grade, never returned to it. So third grade for me was 38 years ago. I don't remember what we talked about in third grade. Do you? And so there's this idea of if you just know the grammatical terms, you'll know the language better. It can help, but I wouldn't get stuck on that either. You have to be reminded of the overall big picture and your overall goal. If your goal is understand the minute differences and details of grammar, that's a very advanced language learner's goal.
And the way I've approached grammar in the past, and I think it seems to relieve a lot of anxiety among students, is that when it's necessary, when there's a systematic error in a grammar form, instead of just, okay, I'm going to teach this grammar form, students have to listen, regardless of the fact that they already noticed the patterns. They understand the syntactical aspects and the verb paradigms and all that other stuff related to understanding grammar.
Yeah.
They understand it intuitively. Why do we need to allocate this window of time that can be sometimes up to 45 minutes or an hour when they've already grasped the pattern? So just do like a pop-up grammar, like when you see something pop up, okay, we'll talk about this now and then we'll move on. How do you feel about that?
As a teacher, though, I felt sometimes, so being a teacher is sort of like being an entertainer in a way. People want to be entertained in a way, but they also have expectations of what that's supposed to look like. So everyone has expectations of what learning is supposed to look like. And so if your teaching style violates too many of their expectations, they're going to tune you out.
That's a good point.
So I think an important part of being a teacher, I know this is kind of off topic, but an important part of being a teacher is learner-centeredness. This idea that you're taking the needs and expectations of the learner into account. So it's always good to acknowledge people's fears. So if they fear that what they're saying is grammatically incorrect, so much so that it's going to interfere with the message, you have to acknowledge that fear and say, sometimes you're going to make mistakes. And yes, right, this may or may not impact the message. And I think giving them information about how much a grammatical point impacts the message is useful, perhaps even more useful than what the actual explanation of the grammar point is. So for example, if someone's hung up on grammatical gender, I would say, not that meaning, it doesn't bear that much meaning, grammatical gender. If you say el calle, la calle, it's not like they don't understand that you're talking about the street, so it's a way of encouraging students to pick their battles, I would say, and you as their teacher kind of inform them on which battles they should be fighting at which point.